Okay. And can you see my screen?
And thank you.
Okay. So today we're looking at the draft long-term financial plan for 2023 to 2037. You'll often hear staff refer to it as the budget, and we're often referring to the current year that we're working in. So if you hear us say long-term financial plan or the budget, we're often referring to the same thing. And I'll start off by giving an outline of what we're going to talk about today. I've tried to break it into 3 different segments, as this is a lot of information being brought to you. We'll start off by a background in understanding municipal finances, subsequently with a question period. So if you're confused about fund accounting or any terms that I've given, I'll give you the option to ask questions before I further into the long-term financial plan. The next section is reviewing the base core budget of the long-term financial plan. So this is what we're looking at from a base service level without cutting back and going through some of the details of that. I will then again pause and let council ask any questions or clarification on items in there of what we're looking at from a base budget perspective. Followed by that, the third segment of this presentation will be reviewing the spending packages, other key projects, and what the average impact would be on a home in town from increased property taxes and utility rates. And then final questions and comments, and then we'll go through the next steps and motions in the report. I do anticipate there'll be probably the most discussion in the third segment, which is the key projects and the tax rate increases and whatnot. So let's get started. Okay, so municipalities must annually adopt by bylaw a 5-year financial plan, which includes capital and operating items. The City of Revelstoke opts to do a 15-year financial plan. However, legislated by the province, we are required to submit a 5-year financial plan by May 15th each year. The city is not allowed to budget for deficits. So you'll often hear the term like balancing the budget or a balanced budget. We can't budget to be in a deficit, which is more expenditures than revenues. The city will categorize different revenue streams in what we call funds. And these are segregating financial and accounting transactions. And we'll get into what funds look like in a couple more slides. But this is so that we can look at certain operating items that only impact certain users or residents in town, and that the ones that are not using those services do not bear the cost of those. And it's just a way of us segregating it into its own area. You'll hear us saying the word reserves a lot today in this meeting, and this is money set aside for specific operating or capital purposes. And you can kind of think about this as like cash in a savings account, that we've stored this money aside for a project in the future or certain types of projects in the future, and we refer to that as reserves. Another term that you'll be hearing a lot of today is a surplus, and this is the excess revenue over expenditures, and that's what we refer to as surplus. So each fund has an operating and capital component. We have 4 main funds. We have the general operating fund. This includes vehicle and equipment and waste collection operations. This is also where all of our property taxes flow into. We have a water utility operating fund. And so everyone that's on our main Greeley water system, they pay water fees into this utility fund. And any expenditures specifically for that water system are spent through that fund. We have a similar one for the Big Eddy water system. And then we also have a sewer utility operating fund. Now, each fund is separated in between operating and capital. We also have, for each fund, a general capital fund, a water capital fund, a Big Eddy Water capital fund, sewer, and finally, there's an extra line in capital. And these are for DCC, which is Development Cost Charges Capital Funds, which are projects related to the growth in the community. And so oftentimes you'll hear the terms operating expenditures or capital expenditures, and what does that really mean? So operating expenditures are funded through property taxes, user fees, and grants. These are ongoing expenses that the city will see. They are often linear in nature. Examples of this could be wages that we pay every 2 weeks, general supplies, lease agreements, and so forth. So these are just expenses that we expect to incur on a regular basis and come from the operating revenue of the city. And finally, with the operating expenditures, we see the reserve contributions come from operations. And this might sound a little confusing. However, what we do as a city is we look at our total revenue that we got in a year for property taxation, user fees, and whatnot. And we say, you know what, we're going to store away this many dollars into our reserves, into our cash savings account for a future project. And that's where reserve contributions come from. And then you'll hear us talking about capital and major project expenditures. These are cyclical, one-time, and limited duration. A great example of this will be the wastewater treatment plant that you have before you in this capital plan, and this is starting in 2023. This could also look like roof replacements, skateboard park builds, Grizzly Plaza upgrades. These are projects that, you know, happen every 20 years, every 15 years. They're cyclical in nature. We don't see them happening on an ongoing basis. Capital and major projects, they're funded through reserves, grants, debt, and even sometimes internal borrowing. So that being said, it's really important that we build sufficient reserve levels for minimizing debt. So the more that we can put away to save, the better off we are when big projects come forward, like upgrading the arena or expanding the 4th Street Bridge or doing more paving. If we have a well-established reserves that we've built up over time, it makes it a lot easier for the city to fund them without debt. So there's internal debt and there's external debt. And when I talk about internal debt, that is one reserve borrowing from another reserve internally. So if the transportation infrastructure reserve is low in funds and we've got a project coming forward, it could borrow from the land reserve and pay back slowly over time instead of going out to the Municipal Finance Authority MFA for external debt. And so we do prefer to do that, although sometimes external debt is unavoidable for large projects. And funding growth from development cost charges. So ideally, we try and fund growth through collecting DCCs, and those have their own separate reserves that they're set aside for in specific projects that they can be spent on. Continuing on, so the utilities are a bit more unique than the general fund. We often refer to them as self-funded, and really what that means is the users will pay the costs of the sewer or the water that they're using and not through general taxation. So sewer is probably one of those funds where some people kind of get mixed up, where they think, oh, the wastewater treatment plant, it's being upgraded, so my taxes are being increased, and that's not the case. It's the users that are on sewer are paying for the wastewater treatment plant along with DCCs, and so we call them self-funded. So only the users pay and their full cost recovery. We do not subsidize through taxation at all. And the funding objectives for these utilities is and that come along with the increases that are recommended is sustainable infrastructure replacement. And it can be hard to keep up to date with that. And I know that Revelstoke's seen some big increases in the past, but it is really important that council and the city focus on sustainable infrastructure replacement in these areas. Okay, on to reserves. This is that cash that I'm talking about that we're putting aside into a savings account that we refer to as reserves. And this is us categorizing what we've saved for specific purposes, whether it's operating or capital in nature. It's about those cyclical expenses. There are must-have reserves versus may-have reserves. So there are some of them that the cities are called statutory reserves that we must have. This is the Parkland Reserve, the Land Reserve, and the DCC reserves. We do have the ability to transfer from one reserve to another. So if general capital is low in funds, but transportation infrastructure has a lot, we can transfer from one to the other if council chooses to do so. And what I've touched on once before is the lending and borrowing from one reserve to another. So if one reserve is low and we've got another reserve that's quite healthy that we're not planning on spending from in the near future, we can borrow from that reserve to fund a project in the other. And surplus, accumulated surplus. So this is the excess of revenue over expenditures from prior years, which has not been set aside for a specific purpose. Annual surplus is the accumulated excess of revenue over expenditures for the current year. And so you'll often find, or maybe not often, but you might find that council will come, or staff will come back to council at the end of the year, once we've gotten all of our actuals, and say, hey, we had this small annual surplus this year, and we're looking for a resolution from council to transfer it to this specific reserve, and this is why. It does happen every now and then, but we do try and avoid it. We do need these accumulated surplus in the operating funds to pay for operations prior to collecting taxes. And they can be used for emergency purposes where reserves are insufficient, but we do prefer not to do this. So in addition to all of the reserve balances and reserves we have this accumulated surplus that stays in our books. And if we need to, in an emergency situation, we will pull from it. Although this is very, very unlikely. I'm going to take a quick pause here and see if council has any questions relating to understanding municipal finances and different funds before I start diving into the pages of the long-term financial plan.
Anyone have any questions, concerns? Seeing none, let's move right on, Ms. Moore.
Okay, sounds great. And so when I go through this next section here, I'm going to be referencing specific pages. So some of you may have a binder. I will pull it up on the screen here if you don't want to flip through your binder, or if you prefer to look at the screen. And so let's get started. The long-term financial plan, the first section includes an introduction, some background information about the community. It includes the strategic direction and priorities that council has worked on updating in December with the CAO. And it also includes a flow chart that I wanted to reference. I won't go through the introduction with you, as I'm sure you can read that on your own time. So I'm going to flip over here to page 9. And I'll just give you a moment to flip there if you're going through your binder.
We're good.
You're good? Okay. So this is a flow chart here it's in the introductory piece that I wanted to highlight. And the part that I wanted to highlight is master plans that are in the center of this flow chart. And they really do set a lot of planning, whether it's capital planning, financial planning, operationally planning. And I know that council is seeing a few of them come before them. I know that engineering's been working hard to complete these master plans. And so I just want to highlight that they will likely have some level of impact as we dive into them and digest them and bring them forward on the long-term financial plan. And it may require council to prioritize in the future of what's all in those master plans. And I wanted to highlight that because I do know that's something that engineering has been working hard on, and they are coming forward to council in the near future. And then next, we'll start getting into the operating fund base budget. And I will have you flip to page 2022. Okay. And this, what I'll highlight is that the city's draft planning operating plans represent the costs of maintenance, existing services, and service levels. Requests for new or enhanced service termed operating spending packages are identified separately in this report, as these items are subject to separate council approval process from that of the approval of the base budget. So what I want to highlight is right now we're looking at the base budget. This is what we need to continue our operations the way they are. And this is before any extra spending requests that you will see later in the presentation. I will now move on to page 25. And I'll give you a moment to flip there. So here, and it's page 25 to 26, this is a summary of core budget changes in the general operating fund. And what we do is we go through, and any significant changes in the base budget or variances from year to year, we'll compile a listing of so that we can document what is our total revenue increase from prior years, total expenditures increase from prior years, and the net effect. So what I'll start off with is the total increased revenue budgeted for in prior years that is included in the base budget. I won't go through every single one, but I will highlight some of the larger ones. We have budgeted an increase in BC Hydro Dam grant. And so the dam that's in town here in Revelstoke, they don't pay us a property tax bill per se. They pay us what is called a payment in lieu of taxes. And the provincial government sets these rates. We don't really have control over it. However, when we contacted them, we were pleasantly surprised to see that it had increased more than what we were anticipating. And so we're receiving $373,000 more than what we had budgeted for last year. And they choose the increase based on the overall property tax increase in local governments throughout the province. So I guess other local governments have been increasing their taxes at a decent rate. So this has come through as a significant increase in revenue for the city. You will see a net change in development revenue. So we have increased the total development revenue that we receive each year. And this is as a result of increased development demand in the community and permits. And as we move through here, the next one that I will highlight is the increase in unconditional grant transfers. This is the province gives the city unconditional grants every year. And when I say unconditional, this means that they can be spent on what the city chooses to spend them on. And these have also increased from last year. And finally, the total revenue that is increased in the base budget is $712,000. I'm just going to move down to page 26 now. Okay. I'll just give you a quick moment to flip. And we'll start with the wages and benefits. This is the first line here. It is $119,000. This is to represent increased wages and benefits for the QP staff. That's a total of 4%. You will then see an increase in public works hours. This is to reflect what they're actually spending for increased maintenance that is required in that department. We have savings from a change in benefit and overhead rates. This is another significant one on here. We spent a significant amount of time reconciling what the average benefit and overhead rate is for employee wages, and we were able to find some cost savings there. A few lines down, you'll see transfer of small capital from operations to capital. And this $1 million reduction, essentially what we've determined is that these small capital projects are more cyclical in nature. They're often one-offs, something that we wouldn't see from year to year, and that it would be of better use to fund them through the capital reserves instead of operating. And so there is an impact on the base operating budget with that. And then as we're going down here, you'll see two lines for vehicle and equipment. You'll see one line for 2022 and one for 2023. As you can imagine, the vehicle and equipment costs have increased significantly due to supply chain issues, the pandemic, fuel rates that we don't have any control over. And so we've had to increase our budget quite significantly to account for those increased costs and the increased costs to pay for the replacement of vehicles and equipment. And it has made quite a significant change in our base operating budget. And so the total expenditure reductions from prior years, $169,000. This is skewed a little bit. Normally you would see an increase here. It is a lot related to this transfer to the small capital from operations. And for those projects that will be funded through reserves instead of our annual operating budget. And then we'll go to the next section here. We have estimated new construction. You will hear us refer to that as non-market change from BC assessment. This is new taxation revenue that we're estimating for new development. So we talk about getting increased taxation as we develop more in the community, and that's the number that we are estimating for 2023. And then we'll skip two lines farther down, and that's the increased reserve transfers. And this pretty much offsets the $1 million that you see up above, where we're taking that $1 million in small capital and we are transferring it to reserves. And that it will go into the savings account, to the savings, the reserves, until we identify projects that it is meant to be used for. Small capital does happen annually. There's always maintenance projects that need to be done. However, just with the nature of those type of expenditures, Ken and I both felt like it was better fit to be reserve funded. And at the very bottom here, you'll see the net changes to the general operating fund for the core budget, and it is $30,600. We've worked really hard to try and bring forward a small increase in anticipation of the operating spending packages that are coming forward, and given the current state of the economy and inflation. So this is where you're sitting. It may look a little low in comparison to prior years, although I think we have seen a fairly significant increase in base operating revenue here in this budget cycle that has really helped us out. I'm going to flip back to the presentation here. And so we've pretty much gone through the core budget changes and the operating fund 5-year plan. I will get into the departmental operating base budgets as we go along here. However, this is the summary of the overall budget. Next, we'll be reviewing the water operating fund.
Councilor Palmer has a question.
Yeah, thank
For
you. Sure. Just a question on the transfer of small capital to operations, or from to operations to capital. Do you know a couple examples that would be the larger ones that you're doing that? It might be a question for the Director of Engineering. He's in the room here as well.
Many of them, I would say, are items that are under $30,000 to $50,000 per item. This might look like painting a room, replacing windows. A lot of them are building related. And then there are some for the recreational facilities. However, Mr. Black, Steve Black, Director of Engineering, or Mike Manson, if he's on the call, could potentially refer to some of the projects that they have on their list for this year.
And maybe rather than diving into the details, it's just an interesting thing on this. I've seen it go both ways, and I guess one of my concerns is the something that is cyclical as you've defined it. So we're talking that, say 15 years. So that might be like a road replacement or, paving programs, not the big ones, but the smaller ones, things like crack sealing and that kind of thing. And I guess my concern with that small of capital is then it's more prone to being sliced by councils, cut off, because it's easy money to sort of grab on the short term, and then you get behind on maintenance items. And then, so it's just a comment at this point. I'm just sort of questioning it, and even when you get to things like windows and stuff like that, it's pretty small, and yes, you don't replace windows on a regular basis, but overall, you do building maintenance, and so I guess kind of cautioning in that area. My opinion is that some of those things, without knowing the details, may be more appropriate in operations budget, and then how that's defined in the line in operations budget. Some places use the term of small capital, but it's in the operations budget so that council doesn't start tinkering with those smaller annual things. So that's, I think that's been, I don't know if there's any comments, but would be my concern on that.
But no tinkering.
Okay.
No tinkering.
Yeah.
For sure. If you don't mind, I'll clarify a little further from why Ken and I are recommending to move it to be reserve funded. And I can appreciate Councillor Palmer's standpoint, as that is the drawback of putting it back to being reserve funded. Part of why I'd like to see it reserve funded is because the cyclical items that happen year to year, if you leave them in the operating budget, you could end up with these waves of the operating budget going up and down, which is what we don't want. So if we have a big, small capital year, or big year of little building projects versus a small year of building projects, it can cause the operating budget to increase or decrease. So that's one reason why we want it to be reserve funded. And finally, sometimes it can be really challenging for staff to get through all of their projects by the end of the year. And if the projects aren't completed before the end of the year, it will result in the operating fund having a surplus, which isn't necessarily what we want. We want to try and break even. If we do have a surplus, it's okay. We'll bring a resolution forward to council and we'll transfer it to a reserve. I do find with these cyclical expenditures, sometimes, and sometimes it's just the reality of the situation where you order windows and they're back ordered and you can't get them till the next year. And that's why we'd like to see this be moved through reserve funding. It is really about the cyclical nature of the expenditures.
Yeah, and I'll just make some comments. So yeah, very fair comments, especially in, the recent years. We've had way too much surplus, and I kind of suspect that that's kind of what you're getting at. And my critique on that is that the projects weren't managed well. So if I look, I'm going to use roads as an easier example, and I'm not sure if that's specific in here. So we'll do paving programs. And if it's within the operations budget and it's well planned, then it just happens year after year, and it should be very level without the surplus. But I recognize that certainly in the last few years, maybe several years, there's been these massive surpluses because work didn't get done. And to me, that's a sort of a general concern. But I won't dwell on it any further at this time. Thank you, Mayor.
All right, good, thank you. All right,
Thank you.
Move on, thanks.
All right, thank you. Okay, we'll dive into the water operating fund now. This is on page 28 and 29. I'll give you a moment there to flip. Okay, here on page 28, there is a bar graph that I'd like to point council towards that has the water utility rate increases. In 2022, there was a rate increase of 10%. Staff are recommending 5% and all the way through the next 5 years for the water utility. This does not include Big Eddy Water. Okay, moving on to page 29. Give you a moment to flip if you're looking at your binder. Here you will see 2 different pie graphs, and this is a helpful picture to paint of how these are truly user fee funded operations. So the total revenue here for the water utility is 2.9 million. Most of it is coming from user fees within the city, the users and residents that are hooked up to the main water utility. We have some interest income and some recovery of debt servicing through local area service agreements. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in Big Eddy. And in the subsequent pie graph right beside it, you will see how the operating expenses are divided up. Most are for annual operating. This is the wages, the general supplies, the general upkeep of the water utility plant. And then you'll see a large portion here of 1.3 million being transferred to reserves for future capital projects. And then you will see $100,000 there for debt servicing costs of historical debt that has been taken on for the water utility in the past. And so about half of the user fees are being transferred to reserves or paying for debt servicing, which is the principal and interest of debt payments. Next, we have the Big Eddy Water Operating Fund, and this is on page 31 to 32, so I'll give you a moment to flip there. Here you'll see a similar utility rates increase bar graph. In 2022, it was 3%. We are recommending a 15% increase in the Big Eddy water utility rates. It is a very new system. There's not a lot of capital projects that have been identified because of that in the 15-year plan. However, we do feel like the reserves are not building fast enough to accommodate some of the projects that are coming in 10 years. I think it's just one project. And so we'd rather see a rate increase of 50% right now than a very large hike closer to this capital project coming up in about 10 years. So that's why you'll see the 3% of last year, 15% this year, and then 5% going forward. if you look at the actual dollar value for the annual rate for the Big Eddy water, it is lower than the regular water users. So they are paying less than the rest of the water users that are on the Greeley plan.
Excuse me, sir.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Quick question. Have we explored the option or looked at the alternative of incorporating individual water meters for new construction to kind of offset these charges? Like, is there any benefit to that, going with that method?
So I'm gonna ask Mr. Black if you'd like to weigh in with that.
Your worship, to Councilor Sapinas. The implementation of water meters is a user pay methodology in which people use water, they pay for their water. Right now, we pay a flat rate. Typically, in my experience, water meters are a way of ensuring that people utilize water appropriately and then therefore reserve and not waste water. And so from that aspect, it's very, very valuable. Metering it will be another way of paying that fee. Is it more equitable to somebody who's irrigating a lot versus somebody that's not, they're both paying the same fee? Yes. Is it something that should council desire staff to pursue this option? That would be something for our 5 or 10 year plans to implement. As part of the water master plan, the recommendation, which you'll see next Tuesday, is that the industrial, commercial, and institutional users go to metering right away because they are typically the largest users, in which case we anticipate we'll see reductions of about 5% overall of usage, which is extremely important for our community and having Greeley as a source. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Black. Any other questions, Councilor Palmer?
Thank you, Mayor Souls. So I just flagged the Big Eddy. I've had a couple people approach me from the Big Eddy. They, of course, with the new system, for those that aren't in the Big Eddy, it seems like a long time ago, but it's still fresh in the mind for the long-term residents there. And I think it's going to be, this will be an area that's scrutinized and we may hear a little bit more about. I do have a specific question that was relayed to me and may not have the answer. But when we acquired the Big Eddy, responsibility for the Big Eddy water system, we also acquired some assets from them. Did that stay with the assets, including property? Did that stay with the Big Eddy, like in this fund, or was it absorbed into sort of general operations? And I'm talking specifically on property. Yeah, and I recognizing that question is a little bit erroneous, and because it's not, if it's an asset, but it's not identified necessarily in the fund. So I apologize for that little.
That's okay. To respond to Councillor Palmer's question here, we, from an accounting standpoint, we did bring the Big Eddy water books, because it used to be its own corporation, into the city books, into the operating fund. However, the way that the assets that were amortized were not worth very much in value. So it was, most of what's on the books right now is related to the upgrade to the system that flowed through the city about 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
That answer your question?
Yeah, it'll start drilling down too deep if I keep going.
Okay, I will keep going if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Here is the Big Eddy water utility. Over on the left-hand side, you will see the pie graph for user fees. We only currently collect $195,000 for the system. Keep in mind, it is obviously a smaller system than the main water one. What you will also see is this large portion, which is the recovery of debt servicing cost from the local area service agreement. And this is the agreement that the neighborhood entered when the system was upgraded. And each parcel of land, each property had the option to either pay upfront for their portion of the cost for the upgrade, or they had the option for the city to take on debt, and they paid the city their portion of the debt each year. And so that's what that recovery of debt servicing is the amounts that we collect from residents each year. And I think it's about a 25-year loan. And that's the money that comes in for those debt payments from the residents. And over here
Just before you go on, just out of curiosity, was there anyone that prepaid upfront?
Several residents, yeah, there were several residents that prepaid upfront for this local area service agreement. The agreement stays with the property, which is something that I think people sometimes don't realize. If someone were to choose to sell their house, we would still send a property tax notice with the new owner for the debt servicing that was agreed upon with this local area service agreement. So it stays with the property, and those residents that chose not to pay up front will pay that annual amount on their property taxes as well.
Good. Thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, certainly. And over here on the expenditure side, you will see that more than half of the revenue is spent on annual operating costs. And then we have a portion transferred to reserves, which is only 13,000, and then the debt servicing, which is the remaining 40%. And so this is one reason why we are asking to increase the utility rate for the Big Eddy, is because $13,000 in transfers to reserves each year takes a little while to build. So we'll just move on to the next fund. Next, we'll be talking about the sewer operating fund, which is page 34 to 35. Okay. So we have a similar bar graph here with the sewer utility rates. In 2022, we did a 30% increase to help pay for this wastewater treatment plant that we received a $9 million grant for. And we are proposing a 20% increase again in 2023, followed by 5% increases going forward. My understanding is there's a lot of infrastructure that really needs to be updated in this utility. And so we are requiring another large increase, unfortunately, with the sewer. And Steve Black, Director of Engineering, can speak to that a little bit more. However, this is the rate coming forward with a draft long-term financial plan. If we flip over to page 35, you will find the two pie graphs again and the total user fees that are collected each year. The sewer fees are slightly different. We do collect frontage taxes with sewer fees. And so if you have sewer pipe that runs in front of your house, you will pay frontage tax, regardless of whether you're hooked up to sewer or not. So you will see the user fees and the frontage taxes in this utility fund. And over to the operating expenditures and reserve transfers. We have a fairly significant transfer to reserves and surplus of 1.6 million. This is to cover those large capital projects that are coming forward, including the wastewater treatment plant upgrade over the next 2 years, and the pipes that need to be replaced under the ground that are deteriorating. So this pie graph, you kind of see the opposite thing happen, where we have less operating expenditures and much more being transferred to reserves. And then we do have a portion of it paying for debt servicing, which is the current loan payments for sewer loans that we have outstanding. Okay, and I'll move on to vehicle and equipment operations. This is page 38. I don't have a fancy pie graph for this one. However, I did want to highlight that the increase in expenses for the operations and maintenance of the vehicle and equipment. And you can see here that our 2022 budget was approximately 883 grand in expenditures. And just based off of what's happened with fuel prices and the supply chain and the pandemic and everything with vehicles and equipment, we're looking at about 1.69 million projected for the end of the year. So I did want to just highlight that for council, as that was one of our core operating budget changes.
Question
Go
about
ahead.
fuel.
Yep.
Thanks, your worship. Does the city buy bulk fuel, or are we just filling up at local stations?
We do bulk fuel. We have our own tanks down in Buckworth Yard. And so we buy it in bulk, and then it goes into our tank, and they have a credit card for each vehicle, and basically they put it in and it's audited as to which vehicle uses how much gas.
Perfect. Have we looked into teaming up with some of the local fuel stations to increase the amount we buy in bulk? Looking for ways
That's
to
something you
save
can ask
money?
Mr. Black. Any comment, Mr. Black?
Thank you, Your Worship. Sorry to be speaking from the back of the room, but I believe we do that currently. I can come back with a report if council so desires. Further understand that, or I can report directly to you, councillor.
Would you guys like to see that?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
If you don't mind, I'll just quickly comment as well.
Sure.
The fuel that is filled up at our public works yard is purchased in bulk locally. So we do pay rates that are less than what you see at the fuel pumps on the highway.
Not hard to beat.
Okay. Let's keep moving. Now, now that I've given you a general overview of the operating financial plans for the different funds, we'll dive into different departments to look at their base budget and core budget changes. And we will start with council. This is page 42 to 43. Give you a moment to get there. I still see a bit more flipping. Okay. So page 42, I do want to highlight the grant and aids that are funded through taxation. There are several grant and aids that the city gives out in different grant streams, which are not highlighted in this table. We do receive various flow-through grants, is what I call them, when we receive a grant from an external agency and then immediately disperse those grants to community groups. For example, the CBT initiatives, or what's now called READY. These grant and aids are ones that impact the long-term financial plan and the taxation budget. So there is a listing in here of what we spend each year in grants to different organizations. And we'll move on to page 43. This is the council operating budget for the next 5 years, with the 2022 budget as well. You'll see that the bar kind of jumps a little bit here in 2023. This is related to the council remuneration review and the increase in council compensation.
Sure.
In 2026, you'll see a bit of a spike again, and then a little yellow bar, which represents revenue. This is for the next election cycle. So there is increased costs with election cycles. However, we do get a bit of revenue as we share those costs with the school district when they go through their election cycle as well. Okay.
Yep.
We will move on to corporate services. This is page 47 to 48. Okay. Corporate services is pretty steady with their base budget. There isn't much going on there. The orange revenue bar that you see there isn't related to revenue that is collected from the public. This is the CBT grant that corporate admin manages, and that is that flow through grant that I just referenced, where we receive the money from CBT and then we go through an application process and disperse it to various community groups. Moving on to page 48 is the Bylaw Services Department, which is managed by corporate admin. And you will see here the orange bar is the total revenue and the blue, the total expenses. It's fairly consistent over the years. The 2022 year-end estimate amount is a little bit higher. For those of you that read the questions that I answered yesterday, this is related to an increase in professional services fees due to a couple of files that almost went to trial that we had to get legal involved. So other than that, we're expecting it to go back to the levels that we're anticipating in inflationary increases. Okay. And then the next department we'll look at is finance. This is page 51. I'll give you a moment to flip. Okay. You'll see a bit of varying happening in these bar graphs. Unfortunately, finance was fairly understaffed here in 2022, so you will see it dip down there. However, the 2023 budget and going forward, we are expecting to be up to staffed and just nominal increases. Okay. Infrastructure and Planning, the Engineering and Public Works Department. This is page 54. Okay. You'll see a little bit of varying in these graphs. The increase in the 2022 year-end estimate ones, this is because of the increase in costs of the vehicles and equipment, which mainly impact the public works departments. And we will be transferring some of the small capital or all of the small capital, which impacts some of their budget, to being reserve funded. So that's kind of why you see the amount in 2022 budget versus the year-end estimate versus 2023 going forward. But other than that, again, just nominal increases in the base budget before any spending packages.
Go ahead, Councillor.
Do you know offhand in the engineering and public works, the transfers small capital to capital, or from operations to capital, what order of magnitude of how much that is, or percentage? Or is that a little bit too detailed for here right now?
I would have to get back to you on that one. Yeah,
Okay. Yeah. Sorry for
yeah. That's okay. Several departments have small capital budgets, so yeah, I'd have to look at the listing and just add up what relates to them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess what I'm kind of getting at is what happens when you start to have those kind of transfers on different funds is there's a little bit of magic that happens, or smoke and mirrors, if you wish. And I understand the rationale, but I guess without knowing that information, I don't have an accurate sense of the real operational cost increases, because we're showing a decrease in 2023. But if we take that factor and that's what I'd sort of like to have a better understanding. I guess just in general, it's interesting that we were 9% over budget in 2022, which is kind of alarming for, like, it's a really big area. So I just trying to have an understanding of what's really going on there, because there looks like there's some, including in some of the other things with the equipment, looks like we're having some pretty major jumps in what's happening, and just sort of having a better understanding that would be helpful. But
For sure. Through your worship, if you don't mind, I'll comment. One item that is related to this amount, which I will reference, is just an estimate. I did these estimates in November, so it is subject to change. Is our snow removal for 2022 was quite high last winter in January and February, winter of 2022. We did have a big snowfall, and with snowfall also is impacted by our large equipment. And then we saw a serious increase in equipment costs. And so that is part of that jump there. The snow removal is so hard to predict. We basically do a 5-year averaging of how much we've spent, and however much it snows is however much it snows. And in 2022, in general, we had a big snow year, if you think about last winter in January and February. And then the large equipment and vehicles that are required to do snow removal at the city also increased in cost. So when you look at the 2022 versus the 2023 and onwards, it is much more linear and consistent. There's nothing of concern from my perspective. It's a bit of a one-off year with the vehicle and equipment market values and operating costs, plus the snow removal budget. And what I will say is we do have a reserve called the Financial Stabilization Reserve, and we build this reserve to pay for any deficits that we might have for these unforeseen circumstances. So if we have like a really huge snow year within a calendar year, since our year ends December 31st, we can pull from this financial stabilization reserve to pay for the additional costs. However, we talk about cyclical versus linear, but snow removal, even though it's very much an operating cost, can be cyclical in nature, depending on what the weather is for the year.
Councilor Palmer and Councilor Stickers.
Thank you, Mayor. So then we didn't dip into, yeah, absolutely. Last year, unlike this year, was a big snow year. This year is a very low snow year, and so we might have some savings surplus. So essentially, in a low snow year like this year, if we have that essential snow removal surplus, that's what goes into the financial stabilization fund. And then for clarity, we didn't dip into that though, and that would be part of the reason for this hiring increase is the snow removal, because we didn't dip into the stabilization fund.
A question, Council?
Yes.
Yeah. Ms. Moore?
Through your worship, we are still working on finalizing 2022 year-end numbers. Based off of the estimates that I did in November, I'm not anticipating to pull from the financial stabilization reserve at the end of reconciling 2022 year-end numbers. I will note that we had a very large snowfall at the end of December that is a bit hard to anticipate in November. So we do need to reconcile it. If we do require to dip into the financial stabilization at the end of 2022, I would assume it'd be quite nominal. And that is absolutely correct. If we completely over budget snow removal and had a low snow year, the surplus that we gain from that, we will bring forward a resolution to move it into the financial stabilization reserve, and it can be used for big snow years in the future. So the snow removal budget is an average of historicals. And some years were over, some years were under. We actually used to have a reserve at the city that was specifically for snow removal. However, about 6 to 7 years ago, when we consolidated our reserves, we moved it into the financial stabilization, which is an all-encompassing reserve for one-offs that happen operationally.
Follow up, Councillor, before we go to Councillor Stapleton.
Yeah, so that's really good, useful information. It's for basically, so I'm able to explain, this little bump that's in here, a big bump. And absolutely, it can, get it on, can get into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. I recognize that. So it would be useful to know, what that differential is on the snow, and it's probably in the details. I'll probably be able to find it, but that's good. And then just the final question then, on the financial stabilization reserve, is it healthy?
We do have a decent balance in there. I would ideally like to build it a bit more so that we could have a little bit more of an aggressive operating budget on the revenue side. But there's certainly funds in that reserve to pay for unforeseen things or cyclical snow removal costs. So ideally, we'd build it a bit more, especially years that we do have a surplus. That's where I'll often recommend to put it. We very rarely, I've never actually seen us come in at a deficit. So yes, it's healthy, although I do believe we could get it in a bit better.
Thank you.
All right, Councillor Stapleton.
Thank you, Mayor. So just a quick question in regards to our vehicle replacement program, because we seem to be spending an awful lot of money on that. And so do we own or lease our vehicles, and are we replacing them based on the kilometers, the age, or the hours of the vehicles?
Ms. Moore, do you have comment, or should I go to Mr. Black?
For sure, I have comment. I've been working with the Director of Engineering and Manager of Public Works quite closely on this one, and we do replace vehicles and equipment ranging on life cycles from anywhere from 8 to 20 years. We do review all of our fleet, the conditions and kilometers before going to make a replacement. So I will often see things get moved around in our fleet replacement plan, depending on what's priority, the shape that the vehicle is in, or large piece of equipment, what's available on the market. It is something that we look into in quite a bit of detail, and we don't just blindly replace. We certainly are looking at average life cycles, but also when we get to the end of a life cycle, what's actually happening with this vehicle or a large piece of equipment. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Follow up, Council?
No, thank you.
Councillor Chair.
Just a quick question on the vehicle replacements. Are we going after any of the green municipal funds through FCM when replacing these vehicles? Or is there a plan for that in this or future budgets?
Ms. Moore?
Through your worship, I don't have any secured grant funding through that source. I will pass this over to Mr. Black, the Director of Engineering, just to see what he's got in his plans for the future.
Mr. Black?
Thank you, Your Worship. Councilor Chair. At this time, we do not have any applications out for looking to supplement funding for our fleets via a green fund.
Is this something we'll be looking to in the future?
Absolutely.
We've changed some of our equipment over to electric versus fuel for GHG and that sort of thing, and kind of greening that way.
I think as a council, we should be going after as many grant opportunities as possible, especially new ones like this.
Mr. Black?
Yes, as of 2021, I've directed our staff to not purchase any more small engines to go toward batteries. So we should see all of our blowers and lawnmowers, et cetera, all be battery powered, which are the noisiest and two-stroke. So they are the worst for us. We will be moving forward towards green batteries, including the transit system, whenever we get around to supplementing and implementing a consolidated system.
Thanks.
Councillor Palmer?
Yeah, I'll just make a brief comment and try and avoid going too far off. But I think it's important. So I agree with Councillor Cherry on the on the aspect of where we're going on greening. Just looking at our strategic priority chart, we have climate action, climate change action on the advocacy part. So it's more of the long term. We didn't identify it as the really short term. We have some other climate related items, but not specifically on the fleet.
Right.
It may be something that we need to weigh into a little bit deeper on the overall fleet management, because there's been some pretty substantial changes. That's really, it's probably the most significant thing that's impacting our budget right now is these, what's being described as an unforeseen massive increases. And then where we're looking at as a community on being responsible on the environment, economically and socially as well, but the use of our vehicles and how we transition from that. So I think that's a really valid question. And there is currently grants available for converting to battery operated vehicles, but we should know where we want to go with that as well. So I'm just sort of flagging that it's not as, sort of the top priority, but certainly an advocacy part. And noting also that we've been without our climate action coordinator for a very, very long time now. And maybe that's why it's kind of got missed in the sort of the planning over the last few years. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Any other comments or questions at this point? Okay, Ms. Moore, let's carry on. Thank you.
Okay. We'll talk about planning and development services next, which also falls under infrastructure and planning. Sorry, that is page 57. I'll give you a moment to flip. Okay, so here you'll see the orange bars, which are revenue, and the blue, which are expenses. These ones vary a little bit from 2022 to 2023. So you can see here the expenditures are going down for this department and the revenues are going up. And the reason for this, and this is just to remind you, just the base budget, it does not include any operating spending packages for staff, is that the director of development services was not replaced, and that position was kind of eliminated for the time being, and planning and development services now works under engineering and infrastructure. So that department went from 8 full-time employees to 7. And in 2022, we received significantly more revenue than what we have budgeted. And so you will see us bump that up in 2023. And that was part of the core budget changes that was at the beginning of the long-term financial plan. And going forward, it's just nominal increases. And I think it can be a bit of a balancing act, trying to figure out how much to budget for development permits and fees, because it really depends on what comes through the door. We have seen a steady increase coming in. And so we did feel like we should bump it up to some extent, but we're not going to bump it up to the full amount that we are seeing come through in 2022, just to err on the side of caution. And again, this is something that we'll look at 5-year historicals. The other item I wanted to note here, you may look at the 2022 year-end estimate expenditures, and they look quite a bit lower. The senior building official position has remained vacant, and we are consulting out someone from Sycamoose part-time. But that has caused a reduction in the budget to actuals for 2022. But we do continue to budget for that position in hopes that we will fill it in the near future. Okay, we'll talk about.
Just before we go, Ms. Moore, Councillor Cherry.
Just a quick question with the 5-year plan here is we have We have it said here that we're still using a 2% annual increase for inflation. How realistic is that in today's day and age?
Ms. Moore?
Inflation right now is quite hard to predict, as you can imagine. In a stable economy, we would anticipate about 2% each year. And if you look at historicals up until recently, it was around there. One of our main cost drivers is wages, and oftentimes what gets negotiated with the QP agreement is about a 2% increase each year. Although, given that we're in some unprecedented times right now, post-pandemic with inflation and interest rates, it might be something that we'll need to adjust in future plans when we get better information of where the economy will sit, as it's quite uncertain right now.
So as of right now, we're just gonna go with the historical norms?
Correct.
Okay.
And we'll have a bit of a better idea when the QP agreement is renegotiated this year, as like a significant portion of our costs are wages. And in that agreement, it will outline the wage increases for 4 years.
Follow up, Counselor?
No, thanks a lot. Ms. Moore.
Okay, thank you.
Move on, thank you.
Okay, so community economic development, I often refer to this as CED, or you probably have heard it as CED. This is on page 61. Okay. Economic development, they receive quite a few grants, the MRTT, the RMI, and the EOF, plus various other social grants flow through this department. And as you can see, these bars are growing year after year, which is actually a great thing. Ingrid has secured an increase in MRTT hotel tax from 2% to 3%. From the hotels in town, and plus it will be expanding to Area B, which is the rural district will now be collecting hotel tax that is remitted to the province and then granted to the city through MRDT. That also being said, she did apply for an increase in EOF, which is Economic Opportunity Funds, through the CSRD to increase her operating amount. So that has also caused these bars to increase from 2022 to 2023. And my understanding is she secured several other flow-through grants, like the emergency shelter and other social grants that her staff are currently working on. So that's why these bar graphs have increased from year to year. Okay. We'll move on to fire rescue services, which is page 64. Okay, so the fire rescue services, the bar graphs are pretty stable, nominal increases. The 2022 year-end estimates, the change, the reason why it's dropping into draft 2023 is because of that small capital change. Other than that, the base budget for the fire rescue services, for the most part, remains quite the same. And then we'll move into Parks, Recreation, and Culture. This is page 67. And here, there isn't a lot of movement in their base budget. They are impacted a little bit by the transfer in small capital, as you will see a small decrease in 2023. Other than that, this budget remains quite stable with nominal increases. And we'll move over here to the RCMP budget, which is page 70. Okay, give you a moment to flip. And so here you will see the 2022 year-end estimate dips down a bit lower than what we anticipated with the 2022 budget. And moving into our draft budget of 2023, we have reduced the amount that we're budgeting. And RCMP is a little bit different. It is a contract that the city holds with RCMP. And the way that it works is they will have an authorized strength of the number of staff that they have on hand, they can have on hand at a time. And for example, if the authorized strength is 14, we will only pay for what is actually being used. And oftentimes there are vacancies in their positions or turnover. And we'll refer to this as a vacancy rate. So as RCP members come and go in this community and the time it takes to rehire them. And so Ken and I have reviewed the vacancy rate for the RCMP and historical averages, and we have determined that we are often at a higher vacancy rate than what we've budgeted in the past, which means that we're spending less on our RCMP budget than anticipated. So you will see a reduction in the budget, and these cost savings are reflected in the base budget of the city.
Just taking hers.
Thank you, sir. Just a quick question in regards to the RCMP and then the fire department. I know with the QPE, their collective bargaining agreement is up this year. Is that the same for the IAFF and I'm not sure if it's the FOP for the police or if it's a different organization, but I know we're going to be subject to that negotiation as
Well,
well.
so RCMP just went unionized, I think, last year.
Yes.
So whole different thing. I think they've got a 5-year contract, 5 instead of 4.
Okay.
I think a 5-year contract with that. Ms. Moore, do you have any comment on their contracts with their union and their wage structure? We're pretty stable at this point, I believe.
Correct. There may be retroactive wages that need to be paid out. However, the city has been accruing for that each year in anticipation for it. So it should not impact the budget coming forward.
And IAFF, if I'm correct. So Chief DeRossi, I know you're here. Any comment? Did we negotiate that last year as far as the union wage, or is that something that's done every year, every second year?
Yes, Your Worship, it was renegotiated last year for a 4-year term. However, it was delayed on negotiations, so the current term ends December 31, 2023, so it is up again.
All right, good. So thank you. Appreciate that. Any follow-up, Councillor?
No, thank you, sir.
All right, thank you. Let's carry on.
Okay. And finally, the fiscal services on page 72. This highlights the total revenues that we receive each year and the total transfers to reserves. And you can see that it's a fairly steady growth happening over the next 5 years. No big swings. Okay. This is the next pause in the presentation. This is the end of the base and core operating budgets. So I'll open it up for questions if anyone has any further questions before we move into capital spending packages, operating spending packages, key projects, and taxation rate increases.
Okay. Any comments, questions, Council? Seeing none, let's fly right at it. We're doing good. Thank you, Ms. Moore.
Okay, let's keep going. All right, so as we move through the long-term financial plan document, we do have several pages that I have highlighted here to look at. So we'll start with the general capital and major projects plan, which is pages 75 to 76. So this is a bar graph for the next 15 years of how much we're planning on spending in general capital. This does not include the utilities. This is just the general fund. You will see a fairly aggressive budget for the next 2 years. There's a lot of key projects that staff are trying to get done and that have been brought forward as priorities from the previous council. So this is where, and part of the current council's priorities. So this is kind of the trajectory for the next 15 years. And it can be challenging to move through everything for those first 2 years. However, there are a lot of high priority projects in this graph, which we will highlight shortly here, like the school safety improvements and paving and Grizzly Plaza and so forth. Okay, this might be a bit small on your screen, so I'll try and zoom in here. We have on page 76, we have major projects that require further information that are not included in this plan because we do need to get more information in order for them to be included. And then we have key general capital and major projects planned for the next 5 years highlighted. And of those key general capital projects, these are what are included in the large amounts for 2023 and 2024. So in here you can see it's the composting project, Grizzly Plaza, an annual pavement budget, some work to the Big Eddy Bridge, the school safety program, 4th Street Calming, multi-use paths, although those are mostly grant funded, the stormwater for Pearson Road, the development approvals process, the DCC bylaw update, the zoning bylaw update, the housing action plan, the pump track if we do receive a grant for that, and Centennial Park track upgrades. And over here to the left, we have the major projects that require further information until we get a better understanding of how much these projects will cost, what the community wants. We haven't included them in the plan as it varies too much at the moment. So it is recommended that further capital and major capital spending not be undertaken beyond those recommended in the spending packages list until the details around major projects listed above are available, including the arena project. So when we move farther into this plan of looking at the spending request, you will see a list of them that say pending, because we do have a number of projects that we know are coming forward, but we are waiting for either a DCC bylaw update to help fund them or more information like the arena. And so in this list, we have a new arena, which is going to cost us anywhere from $20 to $75 million, depending on what type of facility is chosen. There is a South Revelstoke fire station. At some point, as the community grows, we will require to have a second fire hall in town on the south side of town. We have a couple significant projects from the Transportation Master Plan around bridges to the south side of town. And that will be coming forward to council shortly, that Transportation Master Plan. We have the Jordan River. Council has identified this as a priority. And this project, we would need to identify specific projects and dollar amounts to be included in the long-term financial plan. There is the musical ride that might be potentially coming to town in July. I do believe Ms. Donato is working on a budget for that, and we're hoping to receive some external grant funding for events. And then currently the Public Works facility and yard is going through a needs assessment. And when that needs assessment is completed, there will be recommendations that come with it of facility upgrades. And finally, the Revelstoke Community Energy Corporation, they will need some level of assistance from the city since their last fire in February 2021. They haven't been able to quite get back on their feet. Okay. And then we'll move on to page 77.
So just for clarity on the left hand, those major projects that don't have good numbers. So I just want to have clarity so that those are not going to be integrated. Plan isn't to integrate those in the 2023 budget. Is that correct?
Yeah. Ms. Moore?
Through your worship, it is correct. However, I will clarify that the intention is to build reserves so that when we have better information about the specific projects, they can be included into the reserve. There will be some level of prioritizing. As you can see, there are some big dollar values there. However, they're currently not reflected in this plan, but the intention is to build reserves so that they can be reflected in the plan when we get more information.
Follow up, Councillor.
Yeah, so I do have a question, sir, on the overall the budget process, and I know you've walked us through it. And first of all, I'd just like to say thank you very much, because you're inherited a number of challenges, I guess I'll put it that way. Just on the philosophy on budget and council's involvement. So kind of what's happened for the last few years, staff have put stuff together and council really didn't have an option on that. And then of course, as we march towards because we're already in 2023, we're already spending money. And so, there's that philosophical question, and it's not a question that I have for staff, but that philosophical question, how much can council actually influence the current budget? And in general, that's our responsibility. It's oversight, and so there's a whole bunch of little details that certainly there's reference to our strategic priorities we talked about, which I really appreciate that. But there is that sort of how much can we actually say? Well, the influence, change, do some massive changes, and that the simple answer is, well, it's just a simple resolution, tell council or staff to do something very, very different. But then that creates a whole bunch of problems on its own. And so I guess as we march ahead as a council and how we say, okay, how are we influencing how the city operates? And things like the electric vehicles, what are we doing as a priority? And there's been inferences, and even in this financial plan, it talks about that at the beginning, and then actually we're kind of ignoring that aspect. And so when I get down to little details, I'm wanting to tinker on a whole whack of things, and it's really, really difficult for me not. I'll pick on a really easy one. Musical ride, capital. I'm saying, no, that's not capital. That's something we do, kind of thing. And yet it's not really something that we should get bogged down at this level and debating those little details. So that I just wanted to make that sort of comment, but it would be very difficult. I'm gathering at this point to have a sort of a major shift on where we're going. And maybe a real question is, so at this point, from your perspective, what practical changes direction could council potentially be making? And what's your expectation on the feedback? Because there is no real resolutions that are coming out from this.
So Ms. Moore, I'll get you to kind of weigh in on that. And then I just want to preface that with, what direction did previous council give? Are we on that same trajectory? Are we working towards what we had talked about in previous council. And then as we move in, and the reason I bring up previous council is because, as Council Palmer said, we're already spending that money. We're into those projects already. So rather than me confuse things, I'll just ask you to weigh in if you could.
Sure. Through your worship, so council can weigh in a couple different ways. I have, as we move through this presentation, 3 different property tax rates proposed. In the past, staff have brought forward 1 recommended rate. However, to council and then to the public, however, I'm recommending to bring forward 3 different rates to you to choose from, and it's how comfortable council is with increasing rates in order to help build these reserves for these anticipated projects that are coming forward, like the arena. The other way that council can have influence is looking at this key project list and choosing which ones they may want to defer in order to build reserves and fund less through debt. And so there are quite a few key projects on our list, and I know a lot of these are very important to the community. However, you'll hear from a budget point of view, a lot of it is about prioritizing. And I think that over the next year, we will see with the master planning that is coming forward between the water and the transportation master plan, there will be some prioritizing that will need to occur in order to actually fund the items that are being presented, as we will get eventually on the threshold of affordability and what can the community actually afford. So in terms of having influence over where we are, there are 3 options that are being presented to council for a property tax increase, and council can certainly prioritize some of the list of the key projects if they choose to, or even remove one if they choose. Yeah.
Follow up, Council.
That's good. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, thanks, Ms. Moore. Appreciate the comment. Let's move on.
Okay. Okay, we'll move into page 77, which is the capital major projects and spending packages. So these are not included in the base budget. They're coming forward as spending packages to be included in the base budget and are incorporated in the 3% increase, which is in the motions on the table, and would be inclusive of the 4% and 5% increase. But I did want to highlight that this would be included in all options that are currently being brought forward. As you can see here, we did rate all of the projects through matrix, with the top score being 42, and then and put them in order from highest priority to lowest priority based off of a scoring matrix. And of these, you'll see the ones that are highlighted in gray are the ones that are being recommended. The ones that are in white, you'll see that they say pending next to them. And this is where staff are recommending that, you know, we don't forget about these projects, but the council wait until they have a better picture of other significant projects that are coming forward, like the arena and other items that are on that list. And so if council chooses to fund multiple items in the transportation master plan, we may come back and say, well, it's actually really hard to do the arena choice that you want because we've got money spent over here. So what we would like to do is, as these master plans are coming forward to council, and as we go to community engagement for the arena and what type of facility the community wants to see, that we leave these projects as pending, and we can come back to prioritize and discuss them through the next long-term financial plan process. Okay. Page 78. Okay, So this is a similar bar graph that you saw to the general capital fund. And so this is how much we're planning and spending on water utility infrastructure over the next 15 years. Most of it is related to the annual rehabilitation capital spending. We'll move into Big Eddy Water, which is on page 79. There is no bar graph for this one because it's just one project, given that it's a new system. This is the project that we're looking to fund in 2029. So this is the reason for the 15% recommended rate increase, as we are currently not putting a lot of money aside each year into reserves. It is a very new system. However, they are anticipating one capital project coming up here in 2029 that we need to save for.
Mr. Parliament.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A question to Steve or Shiana. What about our urgent matter, and that's the $1 million request to bring water to the airport to service and provide water to the new proposed BC wildfire building? Is this in the budget? I know the answer, it's not, because I don't see it. Being that they want to break ground this summer and we haven't found out the best way to finance and pay for that, is Shanna in finance aware of that? Does council know where we're going with that? Because that's something that's literally 3-4 months around the corner. So I'm just making sure that that particular project, due to its urgency, has been highlighted here somehow, somewhere.
So council's not aware, because we just had that meeting with the proponent the other day as to how do they move forward.
Yeah, okay.
Day before yesterday, we haven't had that discussion yet. And we haven't had that discussion because it's like, what way do we go? How do we get CSRD involved? How do we do that sort of thing? So Mr. Black, I'll refer to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship, and to council. As mentioned, we met with Ministry of Forests this week. They're looking to build the largest fire base for this part of British Columbia, and hopefully to be operational by next year. One of their key aspects that's needed from the city is adequate potable water and fire protection for this new facility. The facility is at the airport, which is within the city boundaries. However, Airport Way is in CSRD. And so we will have to extend the existing 2-inch galvanized pipe that goes from Williamson Lake to the airport and replace that with an 8-inch or 200 millimeter pipe to the airport. The estimated cost is about $1 million. As of yesterday morning, I did forward an email to finance to see if we can find a mechanism to fund this that would not impact the local residents, and that would be either a local area service, some sort of repayment plan, borrowing internally or going out to borrow from MFA, and then having the ability to bill the ministry for that infrastructure. So it's in early days and trying to understand the implications, but the goal is to provide that service and to have no impact to the residents from a financial perspective.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Black.
Thank you.
Mr. Palmer.
Yeah, since that's been brought up, I mean, this is all new to council. $1 million projects don't happen in a few months. If this is for the province, quite frankly, and it's happening this year, the answer is easy. The province can pay for it. 100%. And I'm dead serious. This doesn't just happen like this. And there's, complications with this going through the regional district. Right away, we're going to hear from everybody in that regional district area is going to be wanting to tap into that water source. So your 8-inch line isn't anywhere near big enough for this. I just find it a little irritating, I guess. I guess that's kind of obvious. So, you know, I just say this is a non-starter until we've had a separate dialogue. The province needs to, you know, have a letter coming to council how we're going to be, you know, going ahead. And there is a policy right now, because it's very, very much will be anticipated that those people will want to be tapping into the water in the regional district. There is a policy, it's been longstanding, this is a controversy in the past, that no, we don't. And so, but as soon as that line is going through regional district land, so I think it starts to open up the whole question about, you know, that line going down there, whose jurisdiction is that? So that's transfer of land from CSRD to the city of Revelstoke. I'll stop there. Thank you, Mayor Souls.
No, thanks for your comment. And yes, there'll be more conversations regarding this as to how we move forward, what our options are. And at this point in time, we need to have that conversation both with the province and the CSRD as to, they were on the call, as to how we can move forward on this sort of thing to make this come to fruition in a way that is not hard on our community, bearing in mind what your comments have just been. So thanks for that. Any further comment, Mr. Parliament?
No, that's it.
All right. Good. Councillor Orlando.
Your worship, I thank you. Yeah, I'll just echo the statement regarding existing policy on expansion, water expansion. This has been something we've been through before up at Thomas Brook, et cetera. And yeah, just note that there is existing policy in place regarding, for example, providing services outside the city.
Yeah. And so for those of you that aren't aware, Thomas Brook area is just south of the resort, and that area was annexed into the city to provide water sewer services to them. So, all right, let's move on. Ms. Moore.
Okay. And so I think we're done talking about the Big Eddy water utility capital projects plan. It's just the one here in 2029. Okay, we'll move into the sewer utility capital plan. Okay, in this capital plan, it does not include DCC, development cost charge funded projects. This will be in a page further down. So that's where the wastewater treatment plant upgrade is. So just to quickly clarify that. In this capital plan, this is what the rate increase would be paying for is the annual rehabilitation and renewal, a sewage grinder, and some upgrades to the Burke lift station over the next 5 years. And then we will get into the vehicle and equipment capital plan on page 81. This is the current replacement plan. We are in the process of identifying which specific units we can replace in the next few years. So it's made this bar graph look a little funny, or like we're not spending very much money in the next 5 years. It has been a challenging process for staff with the supply chain versus what's needed and versus what we weren't able to get in 2022. So please note that the next 5 years will be updated. However, it will not impact the resolutions coming forward for the 3%, 4%, and 5% long-term financial plan. And finally, we'll have the DCC capital projects. This is where the wastewater treatment plant upgrade is. And this is page 82. Okay, so we do in the next 5 years have a few DCC funded projects coming forward, or partially DCC funded. We have the wastewater treatment plant, which the total cost is $16.8 million. And we did receive a $9.8 million grant for that. And originally staff or council approved up to a $7 million loan authorization bylaw. So the city has the option to take on debt up to $7 million. We are trying to minimize that as much as possible through funds through the DCC internal debt, so internal borrowing from a different reserve, and then current reserve funds that we have available. And the remaining amount will be through external debt, which at the moment, depending on final project costs, we're estimating approximately $2 million in external debt. We do have another sewer project on here, which is subject to an updated DCC bylaw, and a couple smaller ones lower down.
Good.
Go ahead, Councilor Palmer.
Thank you for, on how you're been really looking at how we're doing debt. I really, really appreciate that, including, I think, much more responsible than maybe how we've been in the past in utilizing assets that we have, our reserve funds and others. I guess a question that comes out though on a major project like this, and the sewer is gone through, a very robust process. And when I say robust, it's not how it's been overused way too often here. Thank you for not using that word. But anyway, the sewer, we went through the liquid waste management plan, well thought through, really scrutinized. And yes, we've had increases, and I'm supportive because of just such a good process. And thank you, Steve Black, for leading that and going ahead. It seems to me when we get to the long-term debt on something like that, we may not be wise to be. I'm questioning whether we should be using internal borrowing for something like that, because that may limit our ability for smaller projects that are more, like this is a long-term, very, very long-term project. We're talking 25 plus years kind of thing. And so it's just a comment, I guess, at this point. I don't know if you have any sort of comments on my comment, but I just sort of questioning whether we should, I'm thinking that probably we should actually be borrowing externally for this, but I'll certainly listen to any comments that you may have on that.
Ms. Moore, comment?
Certainly. So it is a bit of a tricky balance between internal debt versus external debt. Some of this would be the DCC. So we collect water, sewer, and roads DCCs, and you can borrow from within the DCC reserve program and the funds that are there. So some of the internal debt is related to that, where we are borrowing internally via DCCs. I will highlight with external debt that we do lock into a either a 15, 20, 25-year loan cycle with Municipal Finance Authority, and you can only, when you get to your every 5-year refinancing mark, you can only pay off the entire loan or continue as is. So there isn't the option to say, hey, we have this $5 million in debt on the books. We're up for renewal for this loan, and we want to put down $1 million to reduce our debt. So when you do go through external debt funding, it does lock you in a little bit, where you either pay off the whole debt in full or you continue the entire term. So it is the long-term financial plan, like the way we've set it up is we're trying to minimize that external interest that comes with external debt borrowing. I'd minimize our interest expense so that we can build reserves that way. And instead of paying for debt servicing, that money can go to building a reserve.
Comment?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I guess I don't think we would be such a debate on this if the interest rates weren't so high right now, and I recognize that challenge. Uh, I can make more comments about historical because we've been kind of conditioned for the last couple decades on the 2%. That was totally was illusionary going back several decades. So if you go back, I'll mention this because I think it's important. So back in the 1950s, 1960s was 5% was like, that's what it always was going to be. Then we hit the 70s and we got up to double-digit inflationary things. And, then people are putting investments expecting high returns. And then we went into this quantitative easing kind of philosophy, world economic philosophy, and that's where we've been at this 2% for the last couple decades. And not so. I'm just saying that where we're going, and the 5-6%, it might be more of a historical norm when we look at long term. So anyway, that's that background. Going back specifically to this on the wastewater plant, we're looking at a 25-year scenario of an asset that's going to last hopefully much longer than 25 years. And so I think there is a long-term sort of view, and recognizing, we don't have that crystal ball. 5 years time, what will interest rates be? I would suggest that it's not going to be back down to the 2% that we've had for the last couple of decades, but we'll find that out in 5 years from now. The concern that I would have on borrowing on the DCCs is other projects that we're actively planning, and especially with Steve's master transportation planning coming, and how we're dealing with active transportation and how we grow as a community making. So, at what point do we cripple our ability to utilize those DCCs for projects that aren't fully fleshed out right now? So those would be some of my concerns on that balancing act between internal and external borrowing.
Great. All right. Thanks for the comment. Any other comments or questions? Okay, Ms. Moore, let's move on.
Certainly. One item that I will highlight, and it's part of this slide as well, is that the DCC bylaw update will be coming forward to council in 2023, and this will give us a much better idea once that's adopted of how much we're collecting and what projects we can spend them on and when we're anticipating to spend them. I can appreciate Councillor Palmer's comment about making sure that we're not completely draining our current DCC balances. However, the DCC bylaw and collections that we are going to be bringing in the future after the update will look different, and we'll need to reassess at that time as well. Okay.
So, Ms. Moore, we are 2 hours into this now. I'm going to ask that we take a 5-minute break for washroom, that sort of thing. Replenish coffee and water, and then we'll get back at it. Are you okay with that?
I'm okay with that.
All right. Ms. Rousseau, could you let the public know we're going to take a 5-minute break?
Yes, Your Worship. Shanna, if you don't mind stopping to share your screen just for a few minutes so I can put the notice up. Thank you.
Ms. Russo, we're ready to get back at her. If you could, thank you. All right, Ms. Moore, let's carry on.
Okay, I will share my screen again. Just give me a moment here. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. There's only 22 slides, so we're getting close. I'll get you to flip to page 84 to 85. Here we have a table of how much we are transferring to reserves in 2022 and what we're planning for the next 5 years. It is also a table with the rate increases that we're recommending, including what was historically recommended in 2022. So you'll see here that the base amount that we are recommending is 3%, although as we move farther, you'll see the 4% and 5% options, and that we are recommending a 5% increase for water, 15 for Big Eddy, and 20 for sewer, with the intention of only having 5% increases for the next 5 years following that. We have not given multiple options for the utilities because the increases that we are recommending are necessary for the current state of the infrastructure, or in Big Eddy Water's case, to build reserves for a capital project that's coming forward down the road.
All right.
And here, this might be a little small, I'll zoom in. This is a 5-year summary of what we are anticipating the reserve levels to look like at the end of each year based off of capital spending. You can see here that the financial stabilization, you did reference it earlier in the presentation and conversations. It does get a little bit lower. Ideally, we could boost that up, but this is typically where we will recommend to transfer any annual surpluses if we have them. And this is a good table if you're ever wondering where the reserves might be at in terms of how much we have or are anticipating to have at the end of each year in this draft plan.
Question on the,
Go ahead.
so regarding the financial stabilization line, does that include things like the tax refund that RMR has had in the past, those massive amounts, or does it that encapsulates those kind of ideas? And what kind of risk do we have in the future of the same sort of scenarios happening?
Ms. Moore?
Yes, so we have here on this plan, and I know exactly what Councillor Palmer is talking to. We have a restricted accumulated surplus here. It's at the bottom of the general fund box, and it has at the end of 2022 projected to be about $250,000. And so this is if we have any properties that appeal with BC assessment and are successful with that, and it's significant to our year-to-date amounts and final surplus or deficit for the year. If we do end up in a deficit, we can pull from here. The appeals that were with the resort specifically, in anticipation of them appealing, all of the increased taxation revenue that we received from them was put into this restricted accumulated surplus in anticipation that they would be successful with their appeal, which they were. So at that time, I believe the director of finance was Graham Inglis, and he transferred it all into this restricted surplus. And then when we had to refund the resort when they were successful with their appeal, we then used the funds from the restricted accumulated surplus. So there was no impact on the operating budget.
So, Ms. Moore, when when the appeal process goes through BC assessment, do they give you indication of what's being appealed? So we kind of have an idea of what that dollar value may be so that we can put money aside for that, or how does that system work?
Certainly. So BC assessment, they are the ones that determine all of the assessed values in homes in BC. They also facilitate all of the appeals and work with landowners that way. The city has no influence over what the assessed value is or what class they determine the property is. So this is a big one. BC assessment will determine it either residential, commercial, light industry, heavy industry, and so forth. And even though we do have zoning bylaws, BC assessment sometimes will reference it if they're not sure, but for the most part, they are always looking at the use of the property. So is it used commercially or is it used residentially, and falls on that versus what our zoning bylaw says. And so when they go through the appeal process, if there are significant ones that BC assessment feels that we should know about, they will contact us directly. And that was the case with the resort appeals that Councillor Palmer is referring to. And that is why we knew to put the funds aside until there was a final outcome on that appeal, which took numerous years. In most cases, appeals are, if people are successful, they're quite small and don't impact the overall budget very much. Okay. And page 87. Okay, so this is the city of Revelstoke's existing debt forecast of how long it will take us to pay off our existing debt. The only debt funded project that we currently have on the books that's externally funded or in this plan is the wastewater treatment plant. And you'll see that the sewer is the dark blue box. And you'll see that dark blue bar get bigger in 2026. And this reflects the debt being taken on for the wastewater treatment plant. Staff are often, and Ken and I are trying to minimize the amount of debt that we take on so that we can save debt servicing room for larger projects like the arena or other big projects that might come forward through the master planning processes. And so this is why we are trying hard to not take on new debt right now, as we do know we have some big projects around the corner that will likely require some level of debt financing externally.
Question, so does this include internal debt or is this exclusively external debt?
This is exclusively external debt.
Yeah, it might be interesting if you were able to send us the equivalent for internal debt as well, just for our understanding.
Sure.
What is it exactly that you're asking for? Because I'm a little confused as to what you're asking for.
Can you put it in lay terms for me?
If I'm assuming correct, Councillor Palmer, you are wanting to know how much internal debt that this plan is proposing from one reserve to another. However, this is not a liability on our books or external, just if one reserve has borrowed from the other.
Yeah, that's essentially it.
Dollar figures, or?
So really what I'm asking is how much have we borrowed against things like DCCs for other things? So like the sewer, in what, how that's, how we're paying that off. in the future, even though it's internal, it's Peter and Paul kind of
Yep.
scenario.
Okay.
Maybe it's more specific to me. I can just come talk to you about that possibly. That might be a better scenario.
I have no problem at all with council getting that information. I think that's a positive thing. I just wanted clarification. Are we talking theory that yes, we're borrowing from this to pay that, or are we talking about dollar figures? We're borrowing $100,000 from this project to pay for that project. That's what I would be interested in, knowing those dollar figures.
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, thank you.
Okay. We'll move into taxes and user fees, which is page 92. Okay, here you will see the 3%, 4%, 5% increases plus the 15 and 20 for Big Eddy Water and Sewer. We have taken and calculated what this will look like on the average assessed value residential home. I do want to note that some of you may have seen the BC assessment release of what the average valued single family home is, and that value is slightly different than this. It's in the low 800,000s. However, the average residential valued home in Revelstoke is $708,000. So I did want to highlight that difference in case you did see that article. 3% brings us at a $57 taxation increase for the year. Garbage fees at a 4% increase is a $5. The water is 27, sewer is 90, and the sewerage frontage is 52. So this brings us to an average increase at 7%. And $231 per the average home in Revelstoke. However, please note that not all neighborhoods are on sewers or everyone in a neighborhood. So a portion of Arrow Heights is not hooked up to sewer, and the Big Eddy is not hooked up to sewer either. And then we've given an example for if someone lives in the Big Eddy, the total increase is $133, and the average increase is 5.3%. So this is the scenario at 3%. I do have a slide on the different property tax scenarios, but the utility rates remain the same.
Yeah, just I had this question earlier and I didn't ask it, but just on the garbage, is that a separate fund?
The garbage is included in the general fund, but we do have it separated through a sub-department where we track it from an accounting point of view separately, but it's not an official separate fund.
Okay, so then that's collected through general taxation, not through utility fees.
It is collected through the garbage fees, which will be included in the utility fees and charges bylaw update.
So when we talk, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off because I think you may be going down the same way. When we talk about our tax statement going out to our community, we're not going to have the utilities on there. So the garbage will be included with the utilities and not on the general taxation requisition, correct?
That's correct. Just from an accounting structure point of view, it's considered the general fund. However, operationally, we consider it a utility, and only the users pay for the garbage, and therefore it does come through the utility fees and charges and is grouped in with the utility rate on the tax notice.
Great. Yeah. So I'll go back to Councillor Palmer in case that wasn't the question you were asking, and I apologize for cutting you off.
No, that's good. I might have some questions, but I'll do that separately.
Just a quick question and maybe clarification. So we are going to be separating utilities from taxes this year?
Yes.
No.
Yes. No.
We are separating them from taxes. We are planning for 2024. Yeah, we would likely need to be billing them quarterly. It's something that we'd bring forward to council as well to get some direction on. Right now we bill utilities annually. And if we were to take them off of the taxes, we would need to determine whether it would be get paid monthly, quarterly, twice a year, once a year. And that being said, we would need to plan for that. And we're already in February of 2023. So the plan is for 2024.
All right, good. Thanks for that comment. And yeah, we bill quarterly for commercial. So, yeah. All right, go back to Councillor Cherry and then Councillor Pollock.
I'm also curious if we're gonna be separating debt as well. For example, you know, if a property owner upgrades a sewer system and he puts it on a 5-year plan with the city, will that be shown in the taxes? Or would that be shown separately outside of that?
Ms. Moore.
Yes, we do for the local area service agreements and some of those, the debt that Councillor Cherry is referring to, we would show it separately on the tax notices. It can be confusing for residents because there are so many different categories between the other authorities that we collect for as well. However, yes, we do show the local area service agreements and any debt servicing that we provide for developers as a separate line item.
Follow up?
No, it's okay.
Councillor Pollock.
Just on the separation of the utility bill from the general taxation, there was quite a bit of dialogue with the previous council, and I think there was a direction provided there. So you might want to just take a look at that, because I think that would still hold. We might want to reaffirm that. So, and I certainly can see why it would be for 2024, be pretty much impossible to do it this year. But I think that is an important initiative for a number of reasons. And you know, although it's not directly related to the budget, it's really on that whole perception when people are getting billed and getting really hammered once a year. So I look forward to that, you know, hearing this year how that's being implemented.
Councillor Orlando.
Your worship, just a question. When you talk about separating it out, are we just talking about how it's printed out or written out on the tax bill, or is it separate
invoicing?
Separate invoicing. Okay.
So when we were thinking, so as Ms. Moore alluded to, whether it go monthly, whether it go quarterly, and we were thinking, I think at the time we talked on previous council that it would be done quarterly. So it'll be a separate invoice. So Councillor Palmer.
Yeah, just update council, I guess, in general, where the thought was with the previous council. So a number of communities charge their utilities separately. And so one of the challenges with the taxation is that there's so many things that it's very, very confusing to understand. And the other is on whether it's quarterly or how it's done annually, or if there's options for people. It alleviates potentially this big hit that they're doing along with taxation and then the utilities. So that's kind of the philosophy that was there, and it was fully supported with the previous council. And it's I think very common in many communities, if not most.
Yeah.
Councillor Lynn.
So they would be required to pay at a different time, as in quarterly. And I'm wondering what the costs would be to implement a new system. Well, and I'll just say my concern up front is sometimes elected representatives have concerns about how what people think the money is for, who's charging it, or where it comes from. I guess my feeling is that can be addressed through how the form is actually sent out. I'm not convinced it needs to be a whole separate other process just for communication purposes. So that's my thought.
Okay, yeah, good comment. Thank you. Okay, Ms. Moore, sorry to hold you up.
That's okay. We'll keep moving. Page 93, I probably won't even flip there, so we can just keep moving, but there is a glossary of terms. If you're ever not sure what something is referring to, you might be able to find it there with an explanation, but I won't go over those with you. Page 97, we'll get into the operating fund and spending packages. 1 second here. This is a summary of the operating fund of all of the departments that we just talked about. I won't dive into any details here, but just highlighting that this is what it is. And you can go through each of them accordingly through water, Big Eddy, sewer, and so forth. And so this is just, aside from the bar graphs, we do have a more detailed operating plan in here for you to review. Although I am going to keep pushing forward as we've already discussed those. And then the comparative benchmarks, which is 103 to 105. Okay, so on page 103 is where the comparative benchmarks start. Sometimes it's interesting to look at where Revelstoke sits in comparison to other communities. It can provide helpful context. At the same time, every community is slightly different and is in a slightly different position with different struggles and whatnot. Although we did try and pick other tourism communities to compare ourselves to, and various different graphs that you can look at, like the average value of a house and how much cash is on hand and so forth. Okay. We are going to get into the spending packages, the operating ones, in a bit more detail here, which actually requires you to flip backwards. I wanted to finish the capital before moving into operating. So we will start with the general operating fund spending packages. This is on page 95, and this is the complete original list that was compiled from staff with final recommendations of a management group of what we were bringing forward to council. So we'll flip over to page 95. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. I'm not sure how big this is on your screen. So we'll start at the top, which is council, committee, and grant and aid. There has been a request to continue the grant and aid support for the golf course for $50,000 a year. This was included in that grant and aid table that I referenced earlier. There has been an increase in grant and aid funding requested for the local museum and archives. The reason why we have recommended those two and not the increase in funding for Street Fest at the moment is because they do use city property, and both have struggled in the past to break even and get by financially. The golf course, the intent is to assist for another 3-year period until the Cabot golf course is completed, where they are anticipating that 2 golf courses in town will bring them more revenue, as we will be identified as a golf destination. The recommendation for the increase of funding for Street Fest, the reason why we've held off on recommending this to council is there's a lot of grant and aid being requested from various user groups in town, and a lot of flow through grants that we do give out and permissive tax exemptions. So staff wanted to bring forward a report to council of how much we give out and where to different community groups before approving a one-off like this. We have.
Ms. Moore, can I just ask a question regarding Street Fest? Being an arts and culture project, can they not apply for grants for this sort of project?
They certainly can. My understanding is they struggle with having secured funding for planning purposes. So the city currently gives them $35,000, which is in the grant and aid table that I originally referenced. However, I think they struggle with planning, being able to do a good job planning for the Luna Fest when they're waiting for results of whether or not they've received a grant or have successfully been awarded a grant. So there are certainly other avenues where they can get more funding. However, I think they're looking for consistent, reliable funding for planning purposes. And if Ms. Donato wants to chime in, if she's here, she's the one that is in contact with that group.
Any comment, Ms. Donato, Ms. Braun, to Ms. Donato?
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, so the increase in funding request is actually for Street Fest and not Luna. And yeah, the reasoning behind that increase is just the artist fees have gone up quite significantly, and then their administrative costs for individuals assisting with the production of Street Fest as well. So we have entered into a tri-party agreement with the Revelstoke Accommodation Association, the City of Revelstoke, and the Arts Council. So Revelstoke Accommodation Association also contributes to this program. In the past, they've matched the city's contribution. And so I am in discussions with Megan Tabor of the Revelstoke Accommodation Association to ensure that they are going to continue on funding their portion of Street Fest. However, they still request additional funds in order to move forward with the entertainment proposed for this year. So I've been working with Ms. Braun to try to secure funding from other sources for them as well in order to make up the $15,000 request that they've asked for.
All right, thank you for that. Ms. Braun, any comment?
To Your Worship, I think Ms. Donato captured the information, and just to add that we do fund Luna Fest substantially through RMI funding, but the burden of the cost for both of these events, Luna and Street Fest, or Revi Live as it's called now, are substantially covered by Tourism Revelstoke, I think to the tune of $100,000 in total, combination for Luna and for Street Fest. So the original intent of the tripartite agreement was to emphasize that Street Fest is not just a tourism event, it's for residents as well. And so the city, having some skin in the game, so to speak, supported those efforts to really, look at the programming and accessibility and those kinds of things, to also serve the residents in the community.
All right, thank you. Appreciate that.
Excuse me, sir.
Mr. Staples.
Thank you, sir. Just a quick question. Do we have a gauge on how much economic benefit there is of offering Street Fest to the community?
Through Councillor or through the Mayor to Councillor Stapenhurst, it's huge. I don't have the exact multiplier effect at hand, but you'll see next week we'll be discussing undertaking a cultural planning process, which will try to quantify that economic impact. There is a pretty standard formula you can apply to cities of different sizes. But yes, it is a huge draw for visitors, and it has a huge economic impact by extending the stay of visitors. If they come for a night and they experience the music, they will often extend their stay to take in different bands on the following night, because they do change nightly. And it's also quantified by tourism. It has the stats, and we'll be presenting those to you as well next week at Committee of the Whole as to the kinds of increases they're seeing in visitor activity based on some of their arts and culture programming. We certainly punch above our weight in arts and culture, and that's hence our interest in Ms. Donato and I co-leading an economic impact process and a cultural planning process to try and understand how, separate from tourism, the arts and culture sector has a huge economic impact and growing economic impact.
And follow up?
Thank you, sir.
Good. All right, thank you both. Ms. Moore, let's carry on. Thank you.
Okay, let's carry on. My apologies for getting that mixed up. We have corporate services has put in a request that we are recommending to bring forward, which is a communications officer. You will note that it doesn't have a large taxation impact, as over the years, their contracted services budget was increased to accommodate some assistance with community engagement and communications. And so in order to have a full-time staff member, they would reduce that contracted services budget.
Okay, thank you.
In development services, we have a planning technician, a role being suggested forward, and this is to help bring them back up from 7 full-time positions to 8, as the director position was eliminated in the last year. They would reduce some of the overtime that they work, and the lead planner, Paul Simon, would spend more time on long range and long-term planning, and his time would be coded to capital projects, which would reduce our operating expenditures for his wages specifically, resulting in a reduction of $40,000. And so that's the planning tech position being recommended. We also have host compliance software here. This is for monitoring short-term rentals. It's $13,500 a year.
Councilor Palmer, you have a question?
Yeah, just on the 2 positions, are those loaded, 2 questions, are those loaded costs? And the second question is, for 2023, if these positions are integrated in 2023, by the time we get to that, it'll be a smaller one. So is there a step between 2023 and 2024?
Great questions. And when you say loaded cost, it is the wages plus the fringe benefits. So that's everything from CPP, EI, like benefits, pension. So those numbers in front of you, the total ongoing operating costs is wages plus fringe plus a one-time associated capital costs for computers and desks and whatnot, if needed. So in terms of your second question of, are they introduced as steps in the operating plan? The answer is no. And you can kind of go one way or the other. At the end of the day, if we don't put in the whole operating increase in this plan, we will have a mandated operating increase next year that we have no control of. So if we put half the position increase in this year, we will have to incorporate the second half of that position. So it's a full year position in the next long-term financial plan. That being said, these staff, if approved through the budgeting process, the budget is meant to be adopted in April. And so by the time you do hire someone, it can take until about halfway through the year to have someone in place. So that being said, we're recommending to include the whole wage budget in this operating plan, just so it doesn't set that increase next year for council that is unavoidable to pick up the second half.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's carry on. Thank you.
Okay. IT brought forward dark trace cybersecurity after looking into it further. And this is for cybersecurity attacks on the city. And Jeff Wilson from IT did not feel like it meets these requirements at the moment. So we are not recommending this to council, although I do believe he is looking into other options and cybersecurity for IT purposes.
Good, thank you.
Finally, we've come down to the fire and emergency services. They currently have 2 term flex firefighters. One of them is funded through the restart funds, and one of them is related to a retirement. They are looking to make them both permanent firefighters. We are recommending to bring forward one of them this year, and starting with that and then reassessing. They also have some project work for fire planning for the project fire planning for the Fire Services Department that they have a term position for, who is also going to be partially funded from a CBT grant. This is not an ongoing request. This is a term request, and therefore it's being recommended to be funded from the restart funds that the city received from the province. We will move into engineering and public works. There are 3 staffing requests in there. However, there's only one that we are recommending. They require more operations operator staff. We are recommending to bring 1 forward, which will actually be split through the general roads and other various public works tax plus utilities. So you can see here that, and as we move to the next page, that a portion of their wages goes to the general taxation, but a portion is through utilities as well, depending on what they are working on. And it's the same thing here. We're recommending 1 to see how that works out, and then from there we'll reassess next year. As part of the organizational review, it recommended a project manager for engineering, and we are currently not recommending the staff position coming forward, and that engineering and staff will continue to use consultants to help with project management. And at the very bottom, there is an increase in operating and maintenance for snow removal for the arena roof, just to make sure that we're removing the snow more frequently, given the condition of the roof. We have not brought this forward as a spending package. We've actually just added this to the base budget that we reviewed earlier, as we determined this was a necessity for that building. Okay, we'll now move into the utility operating fund spending packages. Ooh. Sorry, I just lost my page there. It's page 96. And as you can see, the dark trace cybersecurity is on here as well for all 3 utilities. However, we're holding off at the moment from investing in cybersecurity software. And you will see that same public works position that was recommended above, amounts allocated to each utility where we anticipate that this staff member will be working.
Great.
Okay. And so the capital and major project spending packages plus major projects that require further information. We did already review these. I can flip back up if council wants a reminder on those. They are page 77 and 76, although we did review that in the capital planning process.
Yeah.
We can carry on.
Okay. Okay, here, if you want to look at my screen, maybe I can zoom in, make this. Here's where we give the 3 different scenarios, and this was in the committee of the whole report as well, where we are giving different scenarios for the property tax increase and not the utility fees, and what this would look like on the average home in Revelstoke. Please keep in mind that not everyone is on sewer, so these numbers are really more for the sewer users, as a portion of Arrow Heights is not on sewer. And that to highlight the difference between the 3%, 4%, and the 5% of property taxes is between $57, $76, and $95 for the year on an average value residential home, which is $708,000. The 3% increase encompasses all spending packages that we are recommending. So all of the staffing ones that we are recommending, and the capital spending package, the the table where we've prioritized them and recommended is inclusive of this 3% increase. If council chooses to go to 4 or 5% increase as we move through the bylaw process, the additional taxation revenue received would be put into reserves to save for future large projects and minimize debt, like the arena and various transportation master plan projects that are coming forward. So that would be the intent of choosing the 4 or 5%. The 3% will give us enough for the base budget plus the spending packages being brought forward today. Although council may feel they have the opportunity to build reserves for future spending. And we are recommending in the motions that we go out to the public with all 3 property tax scenarios for feedback. If the public, to give the public the option to comment on them.
Good plan. I like that.
I never say anything.
Councilor Devlin.
Do you have a rough idea what that looks like in actual budget dollars, each scenario there? Like,
You mean for each taxpayer?
yeah, for like overall, like what it would add to our revenue.
Certainly. Can you see the calculator that I just pulled up?
Nope.
No. Okay. Give me a moment here. So 1% increase in taxation is equivalent to about $135,000 in increased taxation revenue for the city. So at 3%, 135,000 times 3, we would be increasing our property tax revenue by 405,000. And then each percentage would be another 135,000. So at 5%, 5 times 135, we would be increasing our taxation revenue $675,000. And 675 minus 405, we'd be transferring an additional $270,000 to reserves each year. This does compound over time. So if you think about it, it might not sound like a lot right now, but over time, each year, we will have an additional 270,000. And that does to add up when you're looking at projects that are 10, 15 years out that we're considering.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Mhm.
Apologies, I need to now. Thank you.
So another sort of generic question. So on the 5, I'll just use the 5%. So say the city adopts a 5% increase and that it's the same across all classes. On the average property, their actual money that they're going to pay on their taxation is at 5%. And so what's hidden in that question is the impact of market or non-market increases. So basically new construction.
Through your worship.
You decipher that one?
I think so. Let me, Councillor Palmer, let me see if I can try and answer that or comment.
I'll make it a little bit easier. So on a house, a typical house, like you've got that typical house that was 780,000 or whatever it was. So that house, assuming their assessed value increased the average amount, will they be paying 5% more on their taxes?
That's correct. So assuming that you are someone that went up the average increased assessed value, yes, you would be paying the 5% increase in taxes, which on the average home is the $95. The non-market change that you're referring to, the taxation from new construction and new development that is increasing our property taxes this year. This comes through the core budget change and is not included in the 5% increase that we're calculating here. So further up in the long-term financial plan, that core budget significant changes, it is an item on there. And it's one reason why we were able to get to only a $30,000 core budget change net effect, is we had $300,000 in the non-market change, or what you could refer to as new construction revenue, which certainly helped our budget. And it is a quite a healthy non-market change amount to see in a year.
So my point on that is one, this is like a well done budget overall, and it feels fairly tight.
Yeah.
Especially when you look at an increase, because with inflation having gone up 6-7%, whatever it's been in the past year, you know, it feels tight. But so I suspect that it's a little illusionary, but because of new construction has put more money into the coffers, so it's, you know, that idea that, you know, development actually helps reduce you know, overall burden, tax burden, as a good thing, appears to be working this year. I question that though, but that's a so. But it's I think it's important because it's recognizing that, you know, that this is a pretty, it feels like a very conservative budget in a high inflationary year, and we haven't heard that kind of, you know, this kind of budget presentation for a long time. Because there's always this illusion of inflation. So, you know, inflation's what I think I would have heard in the past is inflation was 7%. So we need to increase taxes by 7% and a little bit more because we got to do all these new things. So it's just a general comment, and thank you for your for the work that you put in this and providing.
And so I'm just going to echo that, and really, Shannon, Ken, thank you for that. I think this is something that's going to be, you know, I haven't seen that Reader's Digest 10-page package that you're promising me to go out to the public. But, you know, I'm looking at that. If this for us is understandable in a way that actually works, then I think kudos to you, because we've gone skyrocketed here with that. So. Councilor Palmer, you have a comment, and then I'll ask if we need to move on.
Yeah, so I'm anticipating we'll have a letter that might have already arrived from the Chamber of Commerce regarding essentially, I don't think it says mill rate, but essentially on mill rate and trying to reduce the burden on the commercial. And so we haven't had that dialogue here, but it'll be an interesting dialogue as it gets flagged. Often it's not flagged in communities, you know, just it's a general increase, but it's been flagged and it's been noted. And Revelstoke's had a history for a long time of questioning those values and then how statistics are used to show. So I'm suggesting you be prepared. You probably are prepared for that whole mill rate discussion, and then how council grapples with that, because that is much more of a political maneuver than the budget as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Any other comments, Councilor Chair?
I think we should clarify that in that email we just got from the chamber, it's requesting a freeze for commercial tax rates in 2023, not a decrease in mill rate.
And so essentially with that request, if it was granted, that means that homeowner is picking up
the tab,
or the industrial. Yeah.
And I'm going to look at that from both perspectives, because I pay both, and look at that and go, how can I go to some of our elderly saying your taxes are going to go up because I don't want the taxes to go up on my commercial. And so those are always the concerns that we have, finding that fine line and that balance. And that's why we have the professionals to look at it and say, this is where we need to go, and this is how we can do it and balance that out. So thanks for that comment.
And you know, I think it's a conversation you need to wrap this up, but really the argument that's being presented, which has merit, is that our ratio of what the commercial is paying is out of line from what's generally happening in the province. It's much, much higher.
Yeah, and we get compared to the bigger cities as well with that ratio. So that's kind of why it's brought up. So, Ms. Moore, anything further?
No, we're at the end. The final next steps are the motions on the table, and I will also comment what if council could give direction on what their appetite would be for an in-person public consultation. We haven't done this for the last few years due to other reasons like the pandemic and whatnot. Sometimes we don't get a lot of comments from the public from the long-term financial plan. However, there is an option to have a public in-person public consultation on February 28th, regular council meeting.
Okay, I think that's a prudent choice.
Yeah.
I really do. So, Councilor Palmer, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I think the public consult in person is important, that the world's gradually getting back a little bit more normal, and that's a really important component of public accountability. My only comment on the regular meeting is you better not have anything else on there very, very low.
Okay, so next step. So you want to make a motion, some of these motions to go to council, and then we move forward with that. Is that correct, Ms. Moore?
That's correct, yes. And I'll let Ms. Floyd maybe just clarify if we need to make the motions again in a regular council meeting to go for public feedback.
Was that a special meeting? What was being suggested?
Today is a special meeting. No, so these recommendations will have to go to council so that we can do it. Yeah. However, there is a special meeting right after this. So if you guys all were in, let me see, Aaron.
Yeah. So we can't do that. So it can go, but next week we can add it, can we not?
We can, but if the public input is on February 28th, that doesn't give a whole lot of time to digest the document.
Through your worship, if council's able to, if the committee is able to recommend to council and we're able to squeeze it onto the 14th agenda, and Ms. Floyd can comment on that, we are planning to have a public budget guide available as of February 17th is the plan, to try and have it ready by then. So that it will be circulated for just over a week before the 28th public consultation. However, I'll let Ms. Floyd comment on whether the 14th is a possibility.
Your worship, yes, the 14th for sure is a possibility, because all you want to do is for council to ratify this recommendation, correct?
Yeah. Councilor Palmer.
Yeah, so just for clarity, so these resolutions go on the 14th, which it should anyway, in my opinion. The question about the 28th, we can, that date could be tweaked. I'm just wondering if that's reasonable, if it should be a special meeting in its own, like a week later or something like that, but.
So we've got LGLA beginning of March, right? Which is right after that 28th.
Right.
And typically, I say this, but typically not many public will show up to make the comments. A lot would prefer just to send a letter in.
Yeah. So anyway, we can tweak that. I'll put the first motion on the table.
Okay, so I have a seconder for that, Councillor Cherry. Any discussion on that? All in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Item number 2, financial plans, including the proposed spending packages, property taxes, garbage rates, water rates, spaghetti water rates, sewer rates. All of those things all combined in that one motion. Someone want to put that on the table for me? Councillor Devlin, seconded by Councillor Stapenhurst. Councillor Palmer, you have comment.
Yeah, so, it's interesting because now that's going out to the public, I'm anticipating we'll hear something.
Right.
So I'm just anticipating that we'll hear something.
And that's a good thing. We want to hear, whether it's positive or not positive, we want to hear what the community has to say. And I think that's the whole idea of being transparent on this thing.
Right.
So that we need to. So any other comments on that motion?
So I'll just make a comment because it is in front of the public right now. So this is not council endorsing these numbers. It's council saying we're going to present these numbers to the public, and there's going to be that opportunity for public feedback. So
yeah, thanks for that comment, because that's exactly what it is. We're moving it from here to council. Council will look at it in council, in that council meeting, and then be able to endorse it in a way that goes to the community for their input. And then it will come back to council to discuss as to which way we should go. So that the public knows that this isn't cast in stone. That's not what we do. Okay. Any further comments? All right, all those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Item number 3, that the financial packages, including operating capital major project spending packages, be presented for public comment and feedback at the formal public budget consultation session scheduled for the 28th of February. Moved by Councillor Chair.
Sorry, Your Worship, that was an and that.
And that, sorry. So it should have went to the other one.
It's separate now.
But now.
It's separate now. So, okay, we'll go. My apologies. So Councillor Cherry, Councillor Lucio, any discussion on that, Councillor Palmer?
Yeah, I think it's good that it's a separate motion from, I've stated this last year. I think I did the year before. The capital, I really would like to have better discussion the year prior, like this fall, on what our anticipated capital is for the following year. So that would, because those are really council priorities and how we're, setting the tone for the budget process. So it's basically just a statement saying, let's get this, especially the capital, so we have a better understanding where we're going with improving our community as a whole.
And I think that's a prudent statement, but also that sort of thing, if we have the capital, then our public infrastructure people can go out and look for for the bids on the project so that they know that they've got the best price they can do going forward, which is the best for the community.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that comment. All right, any further discussion on this motion? All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you. All right. So we have done all of that. Ms. Moore, Mr. Beauregard, any further comments?
No further comments from me.
Ken?
No further comments from me. Thank you for all the participation.
Thank you. And thank you for getting this work done. We appreciate you both doing this. Thank you so much. All right. So seeing nothing else, I'm going to ask for termination of the committee of the whole meeting, moved by Councillor Lucio, Councillor Palmer. All in favor? Motion's carried. This committee of the whole meeting is definitely terminated. All right.